For the last 2 months, if you can believe it, we have been in this series looking at different stories, different moments in the Old Testament, and doing it to open our eyes to this incredible reality that Jesus has been a part of the story from the very beginning. From those opening verses in Genesis, from the beginning, God created. Jesus was there and he was present. And as we've been going and spending all this time in the New Testament, what can begin to happen is at times, especially in the New Testament, we can come to places or stories or moments that can actually really challenge our view and our understanding of God's character. That God, I thought you were good and I thought you were full of compassion, but now I see something that's causing some tension in that understanding. Especially when we come to a story and a section that we will today where we see God's judgment on full display. And you see God's judgment and you're like, wow, is that really the same God that I see in the New Testament? Because in the New Testament, God is revealed in the person of Jesus. That's who God is. That is the human representation to help us understand who God is. That is the image of the invisible God is Jesus. And you look at that guy and you're like, well, he's just full of compassion and mercy, and he goes and spends time with those who are hurting and those who are suffering, and he invites people towards him who the rest of society has left behind. Like, that's who that person is, and he teaches us that we should turn the other cheek, and he teaches us that, gosh, our lives should actually be selfless, that we're meant to serve and give all of ourselves up for others. And then he models it by going on the cross and giving his life. How can that be the same God that we see here in the Old Testament who is showing us his judgment over a group of people? Is this really the same God? And it is. But what is actually so beautiful when we find those places of tension, we can choose to ignore and skip over and never mind. Let me just fast forward all the way back to the happy stories before Jesus dies. Or we can step in and we can lean in. And what's happening when we feel that tension is what it's actually doing. It's confronting us on really making us ask ourselves the question, what truly is my view of God and what truly is my view of myself? And let me give you an example, especially when we talk about this idea of judgment. Because when I have realized in my life that, oh man, at times I'm like, gosh, that seems a little too harsh, and man, was there another way? What really I'm kind of exposing in my own walk of faith is that question, what is my view of my own salvation? What is my view of my own? How do I think I'm saved? And what I'm asking myself is, do I truly, truly believe that I am saved by grace alone, that it is a gift from God and there's nothing I can do to earn it? Do I truly believe that? And I do. That is the foundational teaching of the Bible, is that we are saved by God's grace. It's a gift. We can't earn it. We can't achieve it. And yet the longer we come to know and to follow Jesus, what can kind of creep in my head is, yeah, I know I can't earn it, but I kind of deserve it a little bit, right? Like, I deserve it more than some of those other people out there, and I deserve it more than some of the people I work with, and I deserve it more than, man, the people I see on TV, or definitely some of the people on social media, and look at their lives. And so I can't earn it, but kind of deserve it a little bit. God, look at what I'm doing, and look at all the things I've done, and look at how much I go to church, and look at how much I have given, and how I serve, and how I use my resources. I mean, God, I deserve this a little bit, right? And that mindset can begin to creep in, and we can lose the reality and the truth that we fall far short of what God's standard is. And the minute we start believing just even a little bit that I kind of deserve it, and look at these things I'm doing, what we're revealing in our lives is that we are not paying attention to God's standard for us, but we've kind of created our own standard. As long as people kind of live and act like me, and if they sin kind of how I sin, it's not that big of a deal. We're all kind of okay, right? And we know who's not okay, and we know who is okay. And we have eliminated God's standard for us, and we have invented our own standard. Because God's standard for us, what is also foundational in the teaching in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, is we all fall far short of God's standard. What he calls us to is to be people that are holy and blameless. That's God's call for us. You're meant to be holy and blameless, meaning without sin. And yet we fall far short of that standard. And if we fall far short of that standard, what we also see is, what do we deserve then? What we actually deserve is God's judgment on our lives. And God's judgment is death, is separation from himself. That's what we all deserve because we fall far short of the standard of God in our lives. And so it doesn't matter if you're up here preaching or if you're leading worship or if you came early to help set up or if you barely stumbled in here today with all the stuff that happened this weekend. We are all on the same page. We are all leveled out in the same way. There's no hierarchy. We all have fallen far short. And so what we deserve out of that ultimately is God's judgment, but what we receive from God is the invitation into his mercy. That's what Jesus does for us on the cross, is he gives us his mercy, this gift that we don't really deserve, but God invites us into. If we remember the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the story of Abram through Genesis. And we looked, for the last couple of weeks, we've talked about that binding covenant that God made with Abram and kind of all of humanity through Abram. And Abram's end of the bargain, what he was supposed to do is to be blameless and to walk in faith. And if he failed in that, then he would receive God's judgment, and we would all receive God's judgment. And yet, instead, what God does is he tells Abram, and he tells you and me, that we are people that receive the blessing of God. And yet the consequence of falling far short of what he calls us to, God takes that consequence on himself. And that's what we see on the cross. That's the mercy of Jesus. And so when we come to these stories that we're going to look at today and we see God's judgment, it's very easy for us to lose sight of at times in our life, man, this is kind of what we all deserve. And it is only through God's mercy that God provides us another way. And so in this story, we're going to see God's judgment. We're going to see God's mercy. Yes, there's tension in that. I'm not trying to solve all that for you. But I want to kind of open our hearts up to seeing, man, God's character is the same from the Old Testament to the New Testament. God is good. God is love. He's full of compassion. He's full of mercy. God is also holy. And God hates sin. And a holy God cannot tolerate sin. And so judgment comes from God. And yet we also so beautifully see God's mercy. So that was a lot as an introduction to start us off with before we even dive in. But I felt like as I was kind of studying through this, I just felt that kind of in my soul, like, man, these are hard places, but we're not going to skip over them, and we need to step in and kind of examine, what is it that I truly believe? And so this morning, we are going to be in a section in the book of Exodus. We are exiting Genesis after 2 months. We are going to begin in Exodus chapter 1. We're going to spend most of our time in Exodus chapter 12. We're going to look at the story of the Passover. But before we get to that, there are a couple key places for us to look at and study. And so, as you see, Grace is going to have the scriptures on the screens, plural, for us. And if you want to follow along, please feel free to do that. Also, if you want to follow in the Bible, I will let you know what verses we're looking at. But Exodus chapter 1, let me give us a bit of introduction before we get to the verses of what's been going on. Exodus is the next book after Genesis. We've been in Genesis the last 2 months. When God was talking to Abram, when he made that covenant with Abram we looked at 2 weeks ago, Genesis 15, God told Abram, a time is coming where your descendants, my people, are going to be enslaved. They're going to be in a land that's not their own, and they're going to be enslaved there. And so that's what God tells Abram is going to happen. As we get to the end of Genesis and we get to Exodus chapter 1, we see that is exactly what has happened. The Israelites were living in Egypt. Things were going great. They were being really prosperous, and all was going really well. But then the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, which is just a title for king, Pharaoh, saw how well the Israelites were doing and became threatened. and says, this is not good that they're doing this well. I actually need to find a way to hold them back down and ultimately to get rid of them. Because if they keep growing in number and growing in esteem, then this is going to be a problem for us, right? He began acting out of fear and says, well, I want to get ahead of this. And so what he decides to do is to put all of Israel into slavery. So he enslaves them all. He begins oppressing them. He decides he tells people, hey, be really harsh with them, right? It's not just slavery isn't enough, oppression is enough. Be harsh, be ruthless, be evil towards them. And so that's what begins to happen for the Israelites. They find themselves suddenly in slavery. And yet, they continued growing more and more numerous. They continued prospering. So it wasn't working. The plan wasn't working for Pharaoh. So he decides to go to the second phase of his plan and says, I need to find another way to basically wipe out the Israelites. And so we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 1, in verse 16, Pharaoh calls some of the Hebrew midwives towards him, the ones that are helping deliver babies, and says, hey, this is what you need to do, and pass this along to all the other Hebrew midwives. He says, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Enslavement, oppression, being ruthless did not solve the problem. And so Pharaoh decides to move towards infanticide, the killing of innocent babies. And remember, male-born heirs, male-born children, highest value in society, culture. And so let's hit them where it's going to hurt the most. And if we wipe out all the male babies, what's going to happen? Population is going to end and die and go away. The midwives feared God more than a person. Even the king of Egypt, they still feared God more. So they're like, we're not going to do this. And so it's not working. And Pharaoh's like, what's happening? How come this isn't working? This is not going the way I thought it was going to go. So he actually ups the ante and puts out this order for all of Egypt. Verse 22 says, and Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. The Nile was that massive river that is floating through there, and he's telling them to drown every Hebrew boy. That was the state of what was happening with the Israelites. That was the order of the land. Oppression, slavery, be harsh with them, and now start killing all their babies off. That was what was going on. And the Israelites are crying out to God. They start crying out. And for hundreds of years, they're in this position, in this place. And God hears their cries, and he raises up a man named Moses. And there's nothing special about Moses, but God chose Moses and says, Moses, you're going to be my mouthpiece. I'm going to have you go to Pharaoh, go to the king of Egypt, and I want you to tell him to actually let my people go. I want you to tell Pharaoh that the God of the universe, the God who created all of this, is telling Pharaoh, release my people, the Israelites, back to me. And so Moses goes to do that to no avail. In Exodus chapter 5, we see God giving instruction to Moses to go to Pharaoh. And in Exodus 5:2, Pharaoh's response, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. See, Pharaoh considered himself kind of a god, and this was a pagan culture, meaning they had gods for everything. You know, it'd be like us having God of light, God of air conditioning, God of TV screens that are working, right? You just have gods. So they had God of the river and God of animals and God of this and God of fertility and God of the sun and God of the moon and stars. All the things had different gods. So Pharaoh's like, like, why do I care about this other God? He's not recognizing that this is the Lord over all of it, the God of the universe. Again, Pharaoh thinks he's a God, so he's like, why do I care about this demand? And so he refuses to listen and refuses to release God's people, the Israelites. And so then God decides that he is going to reveal himself to Pharaoh, reveal himself to the Egyptians, and make a distinction between his people, the Israelites, and the Egyptians. And God decides to reveal himself by sending plagues. And so God sends 9 different plagues to Egypt, to Pharaoh, at his doorstep, hoping that Pharaoh would say, you know what? I get it. You're right. I'm wrong. You're obviously God, or at least a step above me. I will relent and I will release the people. 9 different plagues to open up Pharaoh's eyes and the people of Egypt that the Lord of the universe is speaking. And he is here and he is present. 9 different plagues, and each one of these plagues not only was meant to reveal himself, but it was also a direct judgment on one of the pagan gods of Egypt. And so the first plague that God sends is on that river Nile, where all these babies are being drowned, and the river Nile was their lifeline. It was what gave them water. It was what watered all their crops and their trees and their plants and the animals. That's what they counted on. And there was a god of the river Nile that made sure it was always full of water. And so what does God do? He turns that river into blood, killing all the plants, trees, vegetation, and showing that I am over this river more than any god you think is. There was a god of frogs, believe it or not, and they thought the frogs were sacred and don't mess with frogs. Frogs are great. I don't know. Don't mess with frogs. And so what does God do? He sends a plague of frogs. God sends locusts. They believed there was a god of the sun. The reason the sun rises every morning is because of this god. Pharaoh thought he was kind of a part of this god, like he was connected to that sun god. That's how he, fancied himself. And so what does God do? God sends darkness over Egypt for 3 days and says, oh, you think you're in charge of the sun? I'll show you who's truly in charge of the sun. 9 different plagues to reveal himself so Pharaoh will relent and let the people go and acknowledge God. And Pharaoh says no every single time. One of the interesting things that happened through those 9 different plagues is they impacted Egypt, but they did not impact the Israelites. And the Israelites didn't do anything to earn that cover. When darkness went over Egypt, Israel still had sun. When the frogs and the locusts, all those things came about, Israel was protected. They didn't do anything. It was by the virtue of them being children of God that God protected them. He's trying to make a distinction, saying, this is what my protection looks like. This is what's available for you if you acknowledge me and follow me and recognize the God of the universe. 9 different plagues to have Pharaoh open his eyes, open his heart, release God's people, the Israelites, and he refuses every single time. And so God sends this 10th and final judgment over Egypt. And this judgment is the killing of every firstborn son in Egypt. God had warned Pharaoh about this. If we back up to Exodus chapter 4, God told Pharaoh this is what's going to happen. He tells Moses, go and tell Pharaoh this. He's not going to listen. It's not going to work. But I want to at least tell Pharaoh, I'm telling you what's going to happen. And so in Exodus 4:22, God tells Moses, then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. That's my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. Israel's my firstborn son. The people you threw into slavery, that you're impressing, that you're being harsh with, that you're being evil with, the people whose children you're killing, that's my son. And I'm telling you to let my son go so they can leave Egypt and go into the land I had promised them, and so that they can worship me, their God. Let my son go, or I will treat harshly with your son and pronounce judgment over you. And this is a point we get to. The 9 plagues didn't work. God gets to this point and says, and this is what's going to happen. And yes, it seems harsh. And yes, it seems like such a hard judgment on people. But may I offer this other view as well, that for hundreds of years, Pharaoh, his leaders, the people were complicit in what was happening. The evil was going on for hundreds of years, and everyone was complicit in oppressing and slavery and ruthlessness and evil and the killing of children. Hundreds of years. They deserved God's full judgment, right? Each and every single one of them. And in God's mercy, he says, I'm going to go after the firstborn children for all the reasons we see. hoping that people's eyes would finally be open, that if he brings them down to their knees, they would come to recognize who God truly is. Is the judgment harsh? Yeah. Did they deserve more? Probably. But let us not forget that though this is happening to Israel, was Israel living lives of holiness and blame? No. Israel also deserved God's judgment. But because they were victims of this, and because God was trying to make a distinction, God is going to offer this judgment towards Egypt, but offer this pathway towards mercy for his children. So now our main text, Exodus chapter 12, will start in verse 1. How are we doing? Yeah, this is heavy, right? I didn't time it around Halloween. It's just kind of coincidental. The silence is just loud this morning, which is, I guess, a good thing. It'd be weird if you're laughing. Exodus 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year." What God is saying symbolically is what's about to happen, the Passover, this thing, is the most significant thing that's happened to you all up until this point. This is a life-changing, history-changing moment. What's about to happen, the Passover, you being rescued out of slavery into the promised land. You're going to reorient your entire calendars around this event in this moment. So God says, we're changing the calendar. Mark this. This is the first day of the first month of a new beginning. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. I just love the details sometimes. Sometimes you're like, God, just tell us more. Give us the answer. And he's like, all right, here's some lamb answers for you all. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, without fault, blameless. Year-old males without defect, perfect lambs. And you may take them from the sheep or the goats, take care of them until the 14th day of the month. So after 3 days, on the morning of the 4th, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they're to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and the tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. And so God is giving instruction to the Israelites. This thing is happening, this judgment over Egypt. For 9 of the plagues, Israel did nothing. The Israelites just sat there, and by the virtue of them being God's children, they were protected. This 10th plague coming, what God is saying, I need you to act with a step of faith. In this 10th plague, I need you to step forward in a step of faith. Do you trust that this blood is going to cover you and protect you? That's what I'm asking you to do. So take the lamb, the perfect lamb, slaughter it, take some of the blood, rub it on the door frames of your home, because that is going to provide protection for you. Verse 12. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all of the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. The blood was a sign. The blood was a symbol. God is saying, do you trust me that I will protect you from the plague that is coming? Do you believe that I will care for you? And a sign of that, an act of your faith, is to take that blood of that perfect lamb and rub it on the door frames. And when I see that, then the plague will pass over you. This was a step of faith for the Israelites. Do you believe in the blood? Do you believe the blood will protect you? And we hear that word Passover, and our translation of it doesn't really do it justice. It does to a degree, but we miss out on a pretty important detail. Because in our lives, if you're passed over for something, work, you're passed over for a promotion, what does that mean? You're skipped. It jumps to you and it goes to the next person. Keston has jumped, it goes to Chris, right? Chris has jumped, it goes to Leslie, right? That's passed over, right? It jumps over you. But what is being actually said, and we're going to see it in a minute, translated a little bit clearer, what God is saying is that the angel of death is coming. And that blood will be a sign for me. And when I see that blood, I will stand in between the judgment of death that you deserve. I will stand in between that judgment of death and protect you. I will stand in between. And when I'm in between, that judgment of death will pass over you to the next place, to the next place. Does that make sense? It's not just a skipping over. What God is saying, I am standing in between, and my love will protect you. Verse 23 clarifies it just a little bit more. It says, when the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and the sides of that doorframe and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your house and strike you down. God is saying, I am standing in between. And once again, God is trying to help them and help us understand that what protects, what makes things right, is the blood of something innocent. And if we think back 6-7 weeks ago when we looked at the story in Genesis 3 of the fall, Adam and Eve letting sin come into this world. And afterwards, God comes to them and they were naked and they were ashamed. And so what does God do? He clothed them. How does he clothe them? He kills an innocent animal. He says, you have sinned, you are ashamed, I'm going to cover that shame. Something innocent died. In Exodus chapter 12, we see an innocent lamb, did nothing, going about his lamb day. And God says, you're going to take that lamb, you're going to kill that lamb, you're going to eat his food, and that blood of that perfect lamb is going to go on the doorways, and that is going to be a sign. And I will stand in between you and the judgment you deserve, and you will be protected. Throughout the Old Testament, again and again, when people want to be right before God, when they want to be made right before him, an innocent animal's blood was shed, and that blood would cover them. And that takes us all the way into the New Testament, when a man named John sees Jesus, and he looks at him and says, I know exactly who this is, and I know exactly what he came for. Worship team, you can come back up. John looks at Jesus and says, look, behold, look. There is the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world. Look, there he is. There's that Lamb. There's that Lamb of God. And by his blood, the sin of the world is going to be covered. John is pointing us all the way back to this moment in Exodus chapter 12 when an innocent lamb's life was lost and that blood covered them. It says, there he is. There's that lamb. And that lamb's name is Jesus. And by the shedding of his blood, that blood is going to cover us and protect us from the judgment we deserve. But because of that blood, we are invited to receive his mercy instead. That's what Jesus does for us. That is the story of the Passover and the Passover lamb. We all deserve the judgment. We all deserve the judgment that Egypt got. And yet what does God do instead is he provides us a way. He provides us a pathway to receive his mercy. It is a gift, and there's nothing we can do to earn it, and we really don't deserve it. And yet by that blood, God is saying, I'm standing in between. You will be protected from any of that judgment and instead receive my mercy. God's protective love is available to each and every one of us.